Welcome to a look at narrative elements and terms, designed for 7th graders. First, look at the word narrative. Many students want to overuse the term story, which is really a little more precise and yet a little more vague than we really intend to. In this case, I'm asking students to redefine that understanding as the word narrative. One reason why I don't use this word story is we tend to think of it as being a short story, maybe a novel, but not necessarily something that applies to other genres or forms. In this case, narratives can be fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama, movies, television shows, even art can be considered narrative at times. First term, plot. The definition we're going to use for plot is a sequence of events and a narrative. It's not just the what. What is more of a current events, kind of a look at what's going on. Plot is a more precise term. It's a sequence of events and a narrative. We call it the plot because they're actually determined by a conflict. In other words, if you just have a sequence of events, and that's all there is to it, it's not technically the plot. If you have a sequence of events tied to one main conflict or problem in the story, and they move through the development of that story from its introduction or beginning through its turning point to its conclusion or resolution, that's the plot. You can have a list of all your events and happenings in a day. It doesn't necessarily make that into a plot. Another way to think of it visually is a plot line is essentially a timeline. It's broken at 3 points. When the conflict begins, it's when it goes up. When it changes and can't go back, that's when it turns. And then when it's over. So if you take a timeline and you bend it at 3 different points and do like some call it a plot mountain, that's what a plot line looks like. The key is knowing what those 3 points are. The elements in the plot itself. First, the exposition. To expose means to reveal. So that's when the author reveals, usually the characters and or the setting. That might be the very first thing the author introduces with, such as once upon a time in a land called blank. And so we start with the introduction of the setting in those terms. Once upon a time in a land called blank, there lived a blank. And then the author describes the characters in that setting. The initiating incident. You might have different terms your teachers use for this. I like initiating incident because of the alliteration, but also to initiate means to begin. An incident is an actual event. It's not simply when the story transitions. Another way to think of it is an author saying, and then one day. That's when the actual plot happens. Up to that point in time, typically the exposition is just that. It's just background, as opposed to actual events in the story occurring in the story or narrative. The next part of this is the rising action, where the events lead from the initiating incident up to the climax. The climax is in fact the turning point of the narrative. That's why that's the peak of the mountain. The climax can be described as a point from which the end has been set in motion. Now, some will define, particularly Hollywood likes to define climax as kind of the battle scene, the explosions, the big fireworks kind of scene, the huge argument between the two main characters. Climax for them is about excitement or appeal on the screen. Climax, as we're defining, it's going to be the actual in terms of the plot. What point at which the end is inescapable for the characters in the narrative. That's the climax. Is it usually in the middle? Not directly. Oftentimes it's closer to the end than it is to the beginning. But it can be anywhere, and depending on what type of narrative you have, the climax moves closer to the beginning, closer to the end. Other things about plot. Following action of the events leading from the climax to the end of the narrative. The resolution. How the main character resolves or ends the conflict. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's over for good. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a positive resolution, that it's a happy ending. But it does mean that conflict is resolved, at least in the short term, in this narrative. Can there be sequels? Can the book be a part of a series? Absolutely. But for now, the conflict is resolved, or is resolved as much as it's going to be. The reaction. This is a little confusing for some. First of all, look at the brackets there. It says not every story has one, but you have to look first and know what it is to realize whether none of the above, essentially, is an option in your particular narrative. Once the resolution happens, any event that takes place after that is considered a reaction. Note that the reaction is not necessarily how the reader feels. It's not how you react. It's not the opinion of the reader. It's actually how the characters feel about the resolution. Is it a happy ending? Do they ride off into the sunset? Do the main characters kiss? Do they hug? Does someone say, I'm proud of you? Is there a celebration or party? Is there a funeral or a wedding? Those kind of events tell you how to feel, essentially, about what's happened in the resolution by how the characters feel. To do this, first you have to identify the most important events in the narrative. perhaps 6 to 10 events for a short story, but just do those events in order or in the order they occur. Which one depends on how you're doing time. If it's flashback and foreshadowing, you might just do the order they revealed. Otherwise, for some, people like to do it just in the chronological order of the events. But 6 to 10, make it manageable. Next, you need to define the conflict in the story. Once you know the conflict, then you can figure out which event on that list you've already decided begins the conflict. That's the initiating incident. What's the turning point in that conflict? The climax. And what's the end point of that conflict? In this case, the resolution. Then basically, once you have the 3 points, everything in front of the initiating incident, exposition. Between the initiating incident and the climax, rising action. Between the climax and the resolution, falling action. Anything after the resolution, reaction. Once you know those 3 points, and all you need are those 3 points, everything else literally falls into place. The conflict. Conflict is the problem that lies at the heart of the story. Some people had called the issue. I like using the term conflict because it really describes the fact that it's not necessarily just a concern someone has. It's something that literally causes someone to be in conflict with the world around them, with someone else, or within themselves. Without a conflict to tie the stories and events together, the story itself is nothing more than a sequence of events, like your schedule that you write down in your planner as you go through school day. There are 2 types of conflict, main types anyway, internal and external. Internal conflict is problems or concerns that exist within someone, whereas external, it's between someone and the rest of the world. Breaking it down in more detail, conflict internal is character versus self. Some will do person versus. I like using character versus, and I like the versus terminology as well because it really clarifies there's conflict. It's not everybody's just getting along. Character versus self is often a difficult decision that has to be made one way or the other. There's more than one way to go about that, and it can be a light story, it can be a very serious story, it can be a sad story, but either way, it's about having to make a choice. I would argue every story with interesting characters and complex characters has on some level a character versus self conflict, even for how to react to the climax or the adversity in the story. Other types, character versus characters, direct conflict between 2 or more characters. Character versus nature, that's versus animals, disease, weather, old age, death, but not necessarily nature that's become a talking animal or a rock that's has a consciousness. It's more about nature in its original form. And character versus society, for some this is new, but it's where 1 or more characters fight a great wrong or injustice created by an entire group or culture. It's not just one versus many. It feels like it's one versus everybody. Now think about gossip and the isms, racism, sexism, those kind of things are probably going to lead toward the idea of character versus society conflict. Let's stop there for now. We'll pick it up again the next time with character.